All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience. Apologies for the late start here. We're having a couple of technical difficulties, but we've gotten them more or less sorted out for today. So again, appreciate your patience, and we'll go ahead and get started here. So I am Heather Grant, one of the community admins. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I would love to invite you all to join us with the Maintenance Community Slack. I'll send some more information in the chat in just a moment. Today we have a really exciting presentation from Cliff Williams on MRO and storeroom best practices, the recording of which will be available in the maintenance community on Slack tomorrow. Cliff himself is also available in the community Slack, so if there's anyone else you know who would benefit from hearing this presentation, or maybe more of Cliff's expertise, please feel free to pass along this information. The final piece of housekeeping here before we get started, Cliff and I will be the only ones with cameras and video on today. The rest of you, if you want to answer any questions or ask any questions of Cliff, please feel free to use the chat on the right-hand side of the screen, and we'll have time at the end of the hour to go ahead and answer some of those questions. I'll keep an eye on that chat throughout the presentation and make sure that we are tracking all of the questions. So Cliff, don't worry about that. That is it from me. Thank you again for your patience and for being here with us today. Cliff, I will hand it over to you to get started.
Thanks very much, Heather. Really appreciate it. Apologize, everyone. But I'm in Canada, and it looks as if my internet may be quarantined. I'm not sure, but yeah, something has happened. So I have my great assistant, Tammy, who's going to help me get through this. And so we'll get started. So the next slide, please, Tam. Okay, just who am I? Why am I doing this seminar? And a little bit about me, very quickly. I just recently retired as a corporate maintenance manager for ERCO Worldwide, which is a Canadian chemical manufacturer. Does have plants in the US, South America, and all over Canada. And as part of the corporate maintenance manager's role, I was very lucky enough to have the process owner role for inventory, and that was really a godsend to me, and we will talk about that as we go through this. But it really did allow me to do a lot of things and learn a lot about inventory management. And what can be done. So that was really a lucky learning. I've not fully retired though, because I am still acting as a principal advisor with People and Processes Inc. in the US, and in Canada I look at asset management. It's slightly different in Canada to the US in that some of the Canadian governments have, the provincial governments have mandated that asset management becomes a tool used by municipalities and towns and everything. So it's a big deal in Canada. As part of that, I'm a facilitator for the Certified Asset Management Professional Program that PMAC runs. I am on the board of directors of PMAC, and PMAC is the Asset Management Association of Canada. And we are very much advocating. We are still a maintenance and reliability organization. That's where we came from. That's how we started, and we still continue with our education in maintenance and reliability. Written lots of articles over the years, done and authored the book "People: A Reliability Success Story," which really talks about how one group went from kind of zero to heroes, and how they did it just through using their people as much as using any of the tools and technologies. I do have a wide background. I started off in steel, moved to pulp and paper, ended up in printing, corrugating, worked for Coca-Cola, Wrigley Gum, Kraft Foods, and then ended up at ERCO. So I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of inventory management and the challenges that it presents. And again, I'd just like to start off by saying that we're going to be spending the better part of an hour together, and that is nowhere near enough for anyone to get a really good understanding of good inventory management practices. We'll go over and hit some of the highlights. but you're not going to learn in 1 hour what it takes to have good inventory management. So you're going to have to pursue it a little further, but hopefully this will give you hints and suggestions as where you'd like to look a little deeper. So next slide, please, Tam. Okay, and this is the burning question. I hinted at it when I said around my luck at being the inventory process owner for ERCO Worldwide for inventory. Who owns your storeroom? And that's always a challenge. As I say, I've gone through each of the answers through my career, and it really does impact on how effective you can become. And it leads to something that we will talk about at the end that really is a key component of this. And we'll leave that to the end to get to it. But if you have an organization where finance owns the inventory, it's a challenge. That was the situation I inherited at ERCO, where when I talked about inventory and who owned inventory and who managed inventory, I was told finance. And so over a short period of time, I was able to wrestle it away from them, more because they didn't want to have to deal with it, rather than they thought it was the right thing to do. But it was actually the right thing to do, because finance takes a very different look, different perspective of what inventory management is all about. And if any of you are out there and you're looking at ISO 55000 and asset management, there's been an addition to the first offerings of ISO 55000, and now there is a standard called ISO 55010. And it's actually a very good standard that explains that finance may have a certain way of looking at things, and they will follow all of the financial rules, but operations, maintenance, and things like inventory don't necessarily neatly fall into those rules. And so when you're managing the inventory, you have to look at things differently, but still respect that there are some financial controls and some financial rules. The challenge is if that you are made to abide completely by those rules and not have the nuances that you need to run your inventory management. There's other organizations that they have procurement running it. It's they're purchasing people, and that's what they do. They purchase, and they actually kind of run the show. And of course, they really don't have much idea as to why, what, how, when, but they look at it from a purchasing point of view. And they look at it and they will have their goals. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on as well. And then way back when I first started out, there was actually a group called Stores. And this was in a huge plant. It was in a plant where there were 1,000 tradespeople, over 4,000 employees. And so the Stores itself was a department, and it controlled all of the various parts of inventory management and didn't talk. And in some places, very rarely do we see that actually maintenance owns the storeroom. And it was with the ERCO where I was, as I say, lucky enough to really have two hats, as the maintenance guy and as the inventory guy. And as I said, it really showed that it was the best way of handling things, because we were able to achieve a lot of the goals that they weren't able to achieve before. So the challenge becomes, who should own your stores? And that's the challenge, is that it should be maybe a group, or at least whoever owns the stores communicates with each of these groups that you see above you. And that's the key part of it, and we will talk about it later, is that you will have to follow finance rules. There will be procurement rules. There may be stores, store people and things like that get involved. But really the end customer, the person that really has to live with all of the results, is the maintenance people. So we need to have all of those involved. So who owns the stores is, I won't say not is irrelevant, but it's irrelevant if everyone else has the right involvement. And so when you're looking out to manage your inventory, you have to look at that at the very beginning, because that will set the foundation for building and people understanding why you're doing what you're doing. Next slide, Tam. Okay, we're going to go through these in a bit more detail on each of them. But again, why manage your storeroom? Spare parts, definitely one of the highest cost lines. If you prepare your budget and you look at your spare parts line items, they're going to be a lot of money. There are hidden carrying costs. It's not just what you're paying today. Stockouts can occur, and that definitely can affect your productivity. How much are you getting out of the door? Planning and scheduling, lots of courses, on upkeep and the maintenance community about planning and scheduling, and people and processes do it. It can all be laid to waste by poor inventory management. And as I'll explain, is that you can miss out on a lot of information if you don't manage the inventory properly. So let's dig a little deeper into these now. So next slide, Tam. Okay, click again, Tam, because it's going to be, yeah, we go. Okay, perfect. So when you look at the line items, you look at your budget, you could be spending 30% of your budget on spare parts. So one thing that's always being challenged is the maintenance budget. And so when you're looking at inventory items, if you can manage that a little better, that's where you can get the maintenance budget reduced. But the last thing that you want to do is that you will sort of reduce the budget and reduce the spare parts spend and then impact performance. Really not a good idea. And so sometimes we've seen it where, especially for equipment maybe that is manufactured overseas. When I worked for Coca-Cola, a lot of the equipment came from Sweden. And if we didn't have the right spare parts and we had to expedite a spare part from Sweden, quite often the cost of expediting it was higher than the cost of the spare part. And, so we were really driving up, the spare parts costs through our inefficiencies. And expediting certainly, can affect that. And then, of course, if you're spending money but you're not using the parts, that's just a waste of money. But the learning that I got from ERCO was that if you have the correct data, you have the correct information, you have a correct understanding of what you need, how you can handle it, and everything like that, it is in fact the easiest cost to be reduced if you can manage it properly. But having that correct data is a key component of it, and we'll talk about that as we go on. So next slide, Tim. Okay, there are hidden carrying costs. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay, let's assume that you spend $1 million on spare parts. You've got $1 million in your inventory. It's sitting there in your inventory. You've spent $1 million and that's it. It's a one and done. But it's not. It's not a one and done. And there are hidden carrying costs. Click again, Tam, for... There we go. So the number that gets quoted most often is 25%. So, let's assume we have that $1 million sitting on our shelves. We got $1 million of inventory. Then the number that's used is 25%. So that's $250,000 a year to carry this inventory. So you think you've got $1 million tied up, but you don't. It's more than that. And where does that come from? How do people say that it's, and there are lots of reasons. And some of them that we talk about here are, you think about it where you buy a whole bunch of parts and then, that asset, that piece of equipment comes to the end of its life and you've got those parts sitting on your shelf. They're obsolete. You can try and get them back to the manufacturer. You can try and sell them on eBay, all of those things, but really you're losing their value. And one of the things that doesn't happen very often is during projects. We'll have projects where, okay, we're going to change out, these pumps or this particular conveyor or whatever it may be. And we're doing a costing of the project of replacing these pieces of equipment. And very rarely do we get organizations where they look and they say, okay, on top of the cost of actually installing the new ones, we actually need to write off $500,000 worth of spare parts because they are now obsolete. So that obsolescence builds in and eventually somebody has to write it off. And what usually happens is the project takes off, whatever, and then somebody does an audit and finds out that these parts are obsolete. And so it becomes maintenance and operations or the plants that have to write them off. The damage, how many times have you been in the stores when you hear a big clunk and somebody says, oh, and they're putting that piece of equipment back on the shelf. It had fallen off. They tried to move it. It had slipped. Quite often that's because of poor sort of location management for spare parts. But, nobody really does a complete check and make sure that everything's still functional. They put it back on the shelf and it's damaged. Think about the times when people will go into the stores and they will open up a package. Now that package has got a seal on it. It's got, wax paper and everything else, making sure that, the outside atmosphere doesn't get in. And yet people will open it up and say, oh, no, that's not really the right one, and kind of do a rough and ready wrap, put it back in. And that's already reducing the life of that particular spare part. It's happened. And stores, is somebody giving you the space that you have your stores, or do you have to buy it? You're paid for that real estate. You pay taxes on that real estate. You may rent that real estate, but it costs money year after year after year. And then of course you've got the personnel. You've got the stores people, the people who are doing the issuing, the restocking, the counts, if they're doing counts and things like that. But it's not just those. Think about the people in procurement. Remember, we've got to bring these people back in. As I said, we need to have everyone involved. What about procurement? We've got people who are sitting in procurement merely buying spare parts. How much does it cost? I don't know if anybody's ever done an analysis, but we did it in the paper industry. We found that the cost of writing a PO was around $85. So for every PO that was issued, it was $85. So, there are these costs that are tied up in there. And that kind of drives the point where you want to be sure that you're only issuing POs when you really need to issue POs. So, think of it that way. And then, of course, there's tied up money. You've got $1 million sitting on the shelf. You've got $1 million sitting on the shelf, but you know that it's going to cost you $250 to keep it there. So that $1 million really, is only worth $750. If you took that $1 million and you invested it in something extremely safe, you may get 5%. So the value of the $1 million actually goes up as opposed to go down. So you've got money tied up, and that money could be used for investment, whatever. So that's where the 25%. So now you begin to see that it's not just, from a maintenance perspective, we need to manage inventory properly, but this is a financial exercise as well. Next click, Tam. Okay, stockouts. Now, it's stockouts can obviously, I don't have to kind of explain this, that they can directly impact, your productivity. The last thing that everyone wants to see happen, whether it be operations, maintenance, stores, whatever, is that you have a problem and you go to the stores and the part that you need is not there and the equipment's down. So these stockouts can definitely affect. And let's be honest, is that we, as good as we want to be, as good as we try to be, we always will have some kind of emergency work or reactive work. And that's when the corrective spares are essential. That the plant has gone down or the particular line has gone down, the equipment's broken, everyone's geared to respond. They get in there, they find out what the problem is, they're okay, they're out, and they go to the stores and find out that they don't have what they need. In some instances, I've seen people get really, really frustrated in that they're actually told to, okay, kind of put it back together, jerry-rig it so it will run, and we will get this part rushed in. Again, now we're maybe doubling the cost of the part. But it will certainly make your productivity, what you're putting in versus what you're getting out. It will certainly affect that very badly. And let's assume that you've done some really good analysis of your assets or your equipment, and you've done the analysis and you've come up with the correct strategies that you want. And one of those strategies is that there'll be no scheduled maintenance. And that'll be things like PLC boards. It could be limit switches. So something like a limit switch is, what are we going to do with a limit switch? Are we going to change it out every year? And the answer is no. Why would we do that? Because limit switches don't normally fail after a year. Are we going to try and monitor it? I'm not sure what we're going to try and monitor on something like a limit switch. Not so. Quite often we end up with things like, okay, we're not going to have any scheduled maintenance on it. We're not going to do any PMs and all those things. We're going to manage it. And I don't like necessarily the term run to failure, but we're going to change it when it fails. Now, that limit switch could shut down your whole plant. It could shut down your complete production. And so having a spare part is essential. And when you look at coming up with, a strategy of no scheduled maintenance, spare parts really play a huge part. Yeah. And I won't say they're essential, because there are some instances where the consequences of not having that part are insignificant. If the equipment, the limit switch is on absolutely, not meaningless equipment, but equipment that doesn't impact performance, doesn't impact safety, doesn't impact the environment, then maybe you'd consider, okay, we can live without it for a week and it doesn't matter. But those are kind of the rare instances. So when you're looking at your asset management and your things like reliability-centered maintenance, if you come up with no scheduled maintenance, then spare parts really, really need to be essential. Go give it two more clicks, Tam. Oh, there we go. Okay. So key to managing these stock out things is, first of all, you really should measure them. You should keep track of them. But key to managing them is understanding why you had the stock out. Now, why are we having these stock outs? Why don't we have these, has something changed? It may be that you have a stock out because, and I've seen this happen where there's almost a sacrificial part. So you may have, a problem with a pump or a motor or something, and the coupling tears and the coupling seems to give. And so you change the coupling. And then within a few weeks, the coupling's gone again. And it's because the coupling is kind of the sacrificial part of that setup. And the problem actually lies somewhere else. But because you don't address the problem, because there's this sacrificial part, you run out of couplings. It may be something like that. It may be that, okay, unknowns to you, the supplier who used to be able to give you one within a week takes 6 months to get them. These types of things can happen. So you've got to understand why. And there's lots of reasons for stockouts. We'll get back into the kind of personnel side of things, where if your stores is not 100% locked up, then maybe somebody takes them for a job and doesn't sign them out or issue them and all of those things. So there's lots of reasons why. And understanding those reasons why will get you to the point where you can develop a solution. If you don't, just increasing it as the knee-jerk reaction is, okay, you caught me once and I didn't have one, so I'm going to make sure I've always got two. That's a knee-jerk reaction that drives up waste in most instances. It's driving up the inventory value, it's driving up the carrying costs and all of those things. So don't make that knee-jerk reaction. Try and do an analysis as to why did we have that stock out? And again, go back to the point I made earlier about having the correct data to allow you to manage. So you need to have some kind of analysis as to why are we having stockouts, and there'll be different reasons. It won't be the same reason for every stockout. So you can't treat and every stockout with the same solution. Next time. Great. So definitely, as I mentioned earlier, there are lots and lots of courses, training, everything around planning and scheduling, and everyone that goes on them recognizes that you can make some really significant gains if you have good planning and scheduling. The challenge is, to have good planning and scheduling, you've got to have good inventory management. If you don't have good inventory management, planning and scheduling becomes a bit of a, bit of a gamble, a bit of a crapshoot, whatever. Because when you think about it, you will be looking at having great planning and scheduling. You're doing your planning and everything, and identified the parts you need, and you're looking now to add them to the ready schedule, and you're looking to get them onto the schedule, for the next week, month, whatever it may be. And you check in the stores, or you check on your computer in the, sometimes it's better to do both, but that's another story. But you check and you see in the system that you don't have any. So now it means that you can't put that on the ready to schedule because you don't have the parts ready for the job. Then that usually involves then somebody like the scheduler or the planner getting involved with procurement and taking time away from what they should be doing to try and get the spare parts. And quite often it involves some heated discussions as to why there isn't one on the shelf. I'm trying to do this planning and scheduling, and I've been on a course that tells me that we can gain X number of man man weeks if we plan and schedule properly, and yet procurement, you don't seem to be able to get us what we need. So it brings up more problems, than just not being able to get that particular job onto the ready to schedule. Even worse is that you can put it on the ready to schedule because it says there's one in the system, no problem, we're going to do that. And we're going to say, okay, that's scheduled for next week. And then when people go to do the job next week, they get to the stores, they go to the shelf, or the stores person goes to the shelf, and it's nothing there. And that could be for a number of reasons. There may have been nothing there for a while. There may have been something there when, when the scheduler looked in the system, but somebody took it as an emergency because they had a rush job, and everything. So part of that, part of the hint there is that if you're looking at planning and scheduling and you're going to, look at inventory management, think about kitting. Because if you were kitting and you were actually getting these parts together, that week before, you would at least be aware of that. Because the last thing, you want is that the day of, you find out you don't have that part. Really, it's not good. And that's why it says the discipline and understanding across the procurement needs to understand that, okay, they need to, follow up, because, one of the reasons you may have a stock out, and one of the reasons that may mess up your planning and scheduling is that procurement have issued a PO but not followed up on it. So many times we've seen that, and do procurement understand that they have to follow up on it? Do they understand the impact of not doing it? We have operations group who will, may have an emergency that they consider an emergency, and they'll pull somebody off a job that they're on and say, yeah, well, go get that part from the stores, and they use it. Now, that again has happened as an emergency. As long as everyone understands that, if you're doing that, then you're interrupting planning and scheduling, and that part is not there for a properly scheduled job, then, hopefully they will make the correct decision. So everyone really has to understand the impact of what they do on the productivity in the plant. So kitting is definitely a way of at least identifying if there's shortages, and if not, having at least the confidence that you can do the jobs. Most systems, most CMMS systems, or most EAM systems have a way where you can do the soft commit. And, in those systems, you can soft commit against a work order, so that at least people would understand that, okay, this particular piece has been soft committed to the that particular work order that's going to be done, so people can make more informed decisions. But again, everyone understanding that they play a part in inventory management is a key part of this. Okay, Tam. Okay, you can miss out on important information. Absolutely. If you don't look at the data, and if you don't have the data, it's going to be tough. But definitely, you can miss out on a lot of information. Do you want to know how many times you've used the part? Sometimes you'll see, okay, we haven't used that part for, once in 5 years, and now we've used it 4 times in the last 6 months. That tells you something. Something is going on. You can drive analysis then and figure out what's going on. In one plant that I was at, we did this analysis where there was a piece of equipment that hadn't been changed in 5 years and then was changed 3 months in a row. And what ended up with the analysis was that we'd missed out on training for new employees. That when they were actually installing these pieces of equipment, they missed out a very important step, and so it would fail. And that's why, but if we didn't look at it and say, okay, we've just used 3 of these in the last 4 months, you know, we only used 1 in 5 years, you know, it's like, it was really, you know, a great eye-opener. It was okay, nothing to do with stores, nothing to do with inventory, but it was inventory and inventory management that told us, you know, the problem that we had. And, you know, if it's used on equipment, do you know which ones it's used on? In another instance we've seen is that, okay, we've used, you know, 5 of these, and these parts are used on 12 pumps, but you know what? That each of those parts has been used on the same pump. So it's not really, you know, a part issue. There is something wrong with that pump. Do the analysis and go in. So this is all the type of information you can get from your inventory management if you have the data and if you prepare the reports to look at these things. And those of us who have to manage inventory and manage maintenance, these are valuable tools that are there for free, and just go begging. Okay, Tam? Okay. Give you one more click, Tam. There we go. And then you can rest your finger. Okay, so first of all is what we can do. What can we do about it? You got to realize that all parts are not equal. They are not created equally. There are very different ways and methods of managing the different spare parts. You know, how many of you know that you really do have parts that are sitting on the shelf and you hope you'll never use them? Do you know what they are? Do you know which parts will kind of take you 6 months to replace, and which ones you can get the same day? Because you're not going to manage them the same way. And then you have the parts there that have a kind of a definite shelf life, you know, things like belts, seals, all of these things. They have a pretty much a definite shelf life that, you know, if it's a belt is sitting on a hook or a rack or whatever it may be for 5 years, and then you put it in and it fails straight away, it may be because it sat there for 5 years. So do you understand those types of things? Do you have them set up in the location so that they're first in, first out? Do you manage them that way? So you can't look at spare parts and say, yeah, we're going to handle it and we're going to manage them all this way. It's going to be it's going to be a horse for the course, as it really is. You look at what the impact is, you look at how you can manage them and what you're going to do with them, and then you manage them accordingly. So next slide, Tam. Yeah, and one more. There we go. So what can we do about it? We can do some things like spares classification. Now, there are lots of different approaches to spares classifications, you know, critical, all these other things. What I found when I had the time to play with these things at ERCO was that this is my preferred way of classifying, or one way of classifying, and then you can go from there and build upon it. But these classifications really are pretty important so that you understand what I just talked about is how to manage them. But you can add classifications to them. What works for you, And when you've got that understanding, when you've got the data, is what works for you. And this is what worked for us. We found that we could run reports, and we found that we had millions of dollars across the company of parts that had never been used. And of course, talking, as I did earlier, about finance being involved and everything like that, once finance heard that, their ears pricked up, and that was it. It was like, okay. And the next thing we did was we found out that our auditing group from our parent company liked the sound of that, and they thought that they should get involved and start doing an audit of our inventory management, because that seemed to be financial, not irregularities, but financial implications, I guess is the word, because we were claiming things to be valid spare parts that from the financial perspective, they said, well, you have never used them, so they obviously are not valid spare parts, so we can't claim the value as assets. We have to write them off. And we were talking millions of dollars. And it was okay. And those millions of dollars were going to hit each of the plants. It was going to affect their performance and everything like that. So when we did the analysis, we looked at it and we said, okay, let's take a look at those parts initially that have never been used. And we then, I and the auditor visited every plant that we had and did an audit of the stores and looked at this. But before we did that, we sent the lists out to all of the plants and we said, okay, these are the things that you've never used. Go down to the stores. A, make sure that they're still there. B, make sure that they're in usable condition. And C, tell us where you're going to use them. And that's when we went around. And we found that, yep, okay, 95% of those millions of dollars were actual spares. They were things like PLC boards, again, for long forgotten PLCs, PLC models. You could maybe get them on eBay, but you'd be lucky to. But we had spare boards that if a board failed, and these are boards that controlled our transformers and things like that. If a board failed, our plants would be down. And it's not a case of, okay, we can change out a transformer. A transformer takes like 3 months to change and probably 3 years to deliver. So not having a spare part wasn't going to work. So we decided that we would call this type of thing insurance spares, just like an insurance policy. It was something that, okay, we're all going to need one, and we all have them on our cars, on our homes, whatever it may be, and we really hope we never have to use them. And that's what these insurance spares, and we looked at it and we said, okay, yep, they've never been used, but Mr. Finance, these are valid spares. We're not writing them off, and still had some fights with finance as to whether the value should be written off and everything like that. But then it becomes a financial transaction, and it went up through the organization to the very top for people to decide what they wanted to do with it, because it would affect EBITDA and things like that. So an insurance spare is something that you got it on the shelf. You sincerely hope you're never going to use it, but you're not getting rid of it. To do that, the guys had to identify the bills of material that it impacted on. And in some instances, they didn't have them on the bills of material, but they did know where they were used or would be used. And so they added them to the bills of material. So again, one key component, bills of material to think about. Then we looked at stuff like, okay, we use one of these a year, but we always keep at least 2 on the shelf. Like, this doesn't make sense until we look at it and we said, okay, and now we understand is that it takes at least 6 months to get another one. And depending on how many pieces of equipment, it was being used on, you would keep that extra one. So that we call those safety spares, just the ones that we kept because of long lead times. Again, we needed to understand, where are they used? Are they on a bill of material? How many of those particular models are there in the plant? Because obviously if you've got 10 pieces of equipment that are using it, one may not be enough, two may not be enough, and three may be what you want to keep just in case. But you take into consideration the fact that they're called safety spares. And the reason we kind of started to separate these out was that we wanted to really understand what could the individual plants manage. Well, they couldn't manage the inventory, the insurance spares, because we've already said we're keeping them. We don't want them to turn. We don't want them to be used. So we're going to remove that from some of our calculations. And the same thing with safety spares. Yeah, we realize that we're actually holding more than we need, looking at from a usage perspective, but from an impact perspective, well, we're going to discount that as well. And then we get to the regular spares. These are the things that really have none of these major severe implications or kind of crazy sort of deliveries or anything like that. Again, we need them attached to the bill of material. But these are the ones that we want the maintenance or whoever it is, the group, to manage actively. These are the ones that you can manage actively without having, unwanted consequences. And then there's those things called consumables. And those are the things that are not typically assigned to a bill of material. They're usually high usage, low cost type of thing, nuts, bolts, sometimes gaskets, sometimes fittings, those types of things. So those are the types of things that we call consumables. Next, Tam. Okay, and again, one. Yeah, okay, so very quickly with this one, because this is not supposed to be an education on different systems, but there are two ways of inventory control, and it's P model and Q model. And P is a fixed period model, which is, in some instances, people will order 3 of them every month. What most likely happens is that people will just go and check, a location every month. Things like nuts, bolts, gaskets. They will check them every month and they will say, okay, it seems to be getting low, so I'm going to order them now. These don't have max mins, whatever you want to call it. They are just things that are consumables, and they're managed that way. If you do it smartly, then you have an indicator somewhere that shows that, in a box of bolts, for instance, in a bin of bolts, you may put a red mark line, halfway up the bin. And anytime that you see the red line, you'll order some more bolts. You could have a row of gaskets, and you put a big yellow flag on, the 10th one in or whatever it is. And when you get to the 10th one and you got the yellow flag, you order more gaskets. So it's very much like it's a Kanban, as it's called in Lean, but it doesn't, not normally assigned to bills of material, and usually, again, these consumables, low cost. I mean, the Q is the one where we use max mins, whatever. And again, to answer a question is ROP, ROQ, max mins, they're the same things. It's just that different systems will call them different things. And so when we use them, we use the P for the consumables, as I've explained, and the Qs are the ones where you actually want to manage and monitor what's coming in, what's going out, how many, you'd have a max, mins, reorder quantity, and all of those things to ensure that you don't have the stockouts that we talked about. Okay, next time. Good. That's it. So do we understand usage and lead times? Because this is the driver. This is the driver when we're setting up spare parts. These are the critical factors. This is how you get to the proper stocking levels. And you look at how many are we using? How long does it take to get them? And based on that, and there are equations and whatever, but, just rules of thumb, you can do that. The challenge is for a lot of organizations, how do you pull these reports? Who's got them? Who sets these levels? And again, if it's just one department, you could be in trouble. And so it needs to be lots of departments involved. And it may be that procurement can get the reports easily, but maintenance should get them as easily. And really, this is the critical part of it. And it really is looking at how many are we using, how long does it take to get them, and understanding the kind of whys behind it, and understanding that if you get it wrong, then the implications are really A, catastrophic, B, not so bad. But you need to understand that so that you can make your decisions accordingly. And and then there's lots of things that will come into play, things like a shutdown. So how do we manage? How do we kind of differentiate the fact that we ordered 10 for a shutdown from we used 10 in the last year? You need to understand that, and how do we order things for the shutdowns, because it's not going to be based on max mins, reorder point, reorder quantities. So understanding all around the usage and the lead times will help you, set the correct levels. And if you're looking at those things regularly, you can notice that, hey, there's a trend in usage here. We seem to be using a lot more. Again, that's going to give you to do the information to do what we've talked about all along. Next, Tam. That's it. Yeah. Okay. So are we seeing lots of adjustments when we do cycle counts? First of all, are you doing cycle counts? How often do you do the cycle counts? Because we need to really understand whether what we've got in our system is what we've got in the stores. So doing the cycle counts is one way of doing it. Can we identify where the parts are used again, or which bills of material? Because if you're seeing that you're doing a lot of adjustments in your cycle counts, then something is wrong with your system. And this, when I say your system, your store's system. Why are people taking things and not signing them out? Because that quite often is the first thing that people get said. Oh, they take them. Oh, operations take them. Oh, the maintenance guy take them. Oh, the contractor takes them. But you need to kind of understand, why are these things kind of not matching with what we've got in the system, in our computerized system? And one of the things we did at ERCO was to make things easier, we barcoded everything so that it was just very simple for the people to issue the parts. They didn't have to write on a piece of paper. They didn't have to tell anyone. They didn't have to find a storeman, whatever. And a lot of our plants didn't have store people. So barcoding allowed them to do it. And it would just scan it in, and they could scan it against the work order. Everything was fine. So it was good. And that's how we got the information to look at the root cause. Because then once we got the root cause of these things, we could implement a solution. And it really worked. And as I say, one of the biggest solutions was this barcoding. Okay, Tam. Right. Okay, how often do we audit? Do we do a big audit? We used to do an audit every year. And from that audit, we would look at all of the things that we've talked about so far this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are. We then could understand the usage. We could understand the rationale behind the usage. we could understand the classifications, and we could say, okay, yes, these things are going on. And what that did, it did drive improvement because you have the reasons why. You're able to look at it and you'll be able to say, okay, these are the things that we need to concentrate on. And I think for most organizations, you're not going to be able to jump in and do all of these things because you don't necessarily have the data, the information, the system set up in such a way that will allow it. But at least hopefully it'll give you a hint at the way you should look at it. And the annual audit is where you kind of pull it all together. Okay, Tam. Okay, that's it. So how do we communicate? Go back to the very beginning of the presentation is, are our goals aligned? And that's where we see the biggest discrepancy and the biggest challenge that we have is that the goals are not aligned. And that presents a problem because if procurement are owning the stores and their goals are to reduce inventory holding, that's going to impact maintenance. If finance are saying, yep, okay, we've got to reduce sort of, on hand and we've got to cut back and all, it's going to impact. So we need to be sure that we get all of the goals aligned. So many times I'll go into an organization and hear procurement and maintenance fighting because procurement are accusing maintenance of not knowing what they're doing because they always have to rush stuff in. And then we got maintenance accusing procurement of not knowing what they're doing by saying, we've always got stockouts. And what they don't realize is they're both talking about the same problem. They're just looking at it from different directions. And if they could look at it from the same directions, then they could come up with a single solution. So making sure that if you're going to be managing inventory, that those that impact and influence the ability to manage inventory have goals aligned with yours. Sit down and talk to them because I mentioned it earlier, that's the beginning. You have to get that. You have to get that set up. Okay, last slide, Tam. One more. There you go. Okay, so how do we measure it? Sometimes it's a financial report. And it's just, is the inventory holding getting higher or is it getting lower? And finance really look at that. And that becomes, the focus. If it is how you measure success, then it's a tough one. But again, the results of good management will affect that. Inventory turn ratio. For those of you not familiar with it, it's the annual usage versus the value held. So if I've got $1 million and if I use $1 million worth of spare parts and I have $1 million worth of spare parts on hand on average for the year, that's a turn ratio of 1. A turn ratio of 2, is considered to be pretty good. And that means that you're turning over the value that you have sitting on your shelves twice a year. It means you're using stuff. This was one of the reasons that we wanted to get the insurance spares and the safety spares identified because the maintenance people and the inventory people couldn't do anything about the inventory spares or the safety spares, and yet it made this inventory turn look terrible. It made it look that they weren't doing anything when they were doing good stuff, but it was only with the regular spares. And so we measured the regular spares. So those were the things they could manage. So those were the things we were going to measure. As I mentioned, definitely keep track of stockouts. And it's really, really good to look at those three in combination because they do all affect one another. Because the goals really of all of this and the goal of any of the inventory management courses you may take or is that the item's available when it's required and that it's done so at the lowest cost. That's really what we're looking for. Now, that might bring in things like vendor managed, consignment, standardization, and everything like that. But that's another course. And so we won't go there. So, Tam, next slide. So, does anyone have any questions?
Cliff, thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. Really, really valuable information about, managing your storeroom to the best of your abilities. There are a couple of questions in the chat, but since we're a little bit over time, well, we're at the hour mark from when we started, but since we had a little bit of a delay here, if it's all right with you, I think we can handle these offline. So I'll be sure to take note of who asked what, and then I'll send them over to you to answer, and we can include them in the replay of this slide. Does that sound okay to you?
Perfect. Sounds great. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time, and thank you everyone so much for joining us this morning, evening or afternoon where you are, I suppose. Huge thank you to Tammy for running the slides today. And I think that's all we have. Thank you again, Cliff and everyone, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you very much, Heather. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day and stay safe.
You too. Bye-bye.